Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Night of the Living Dead from 1968. And this is day 5 of my Halloween week of videos. Happy Halloween, by the way, where I review a different horror movie the 5 days leading up to and including Halloween. Night of the Living Dead is one of the most influential films of all time. It's one of the most important films of all time, and in terms of horror cinema, it is definitely one of the most important horror films ever made. It's an important turning point for horror cinema and really what invented all of this zombie shit that everyone's into today. It is kind of the nexus where everything comes from, and not understanding it and respecting it kind of shows you don't understand what a true zombie movie should be. And what Romero really did with Night of the Living Dead was bring a lot of social commentary to the horror genre, which had certainly been there before, but not as nakedly. He was very much purposely saying this means more than just these people in a house fighting off zombies, but because he brought those ideas to it, and because that is in effect a really cool idea, he was able to spread these kind of ideas and influence many because of all the interesting ideas and cool things about this film. This is a low budget, dirty, kind of grimy film, and it was able to live on in that way because of its existence in the public domain. Frankly, I've never really seen a good copy of this in good condition. I know there are some on YouTube actually. There's an HD version that actually looks pretty good, and there's a new restoration out the year that I'm making this review, but I kind of almost prefer to see it the way I used to see it on my crappy DVD I bought at Ocean City, Maryland for like $5 or something. And the reason I think that still works for it is this has always felt like kind of an older cult film. It used to be a midnight movie for an entire generation of baby boomers, and that's really how they grew up with it. It played late night at the movies quite frequently. This is actually made in 4:3. There's nothing wrong with it if you're watching it on Amazon or something like that. It is actually in 4:3 and plays perfectly like a film like Carnival of the Souls, which is actually a really big influence on this film and Romero himself. That kind of spooky kind of feel, and I think Barbara's hair sort of looks like the girl from Carnival of Souls. I'm not sure if that was on purpose or just a coincidence, or just the hairstyle at the time, and I'm putting too much on that, but I definitely can tell that, particularly with its interesting use of cinematography. The way it often uses people reacting to things. One of the great things about Carnival of Souls is that she is haunted by her past, and you can tell that on her face, much like you can tell how Barbara is freaking the fuck out about this whole zombie thing. And this feels at the beginning like a kind of typical kind of cult midnight movie that you probably see the baby boomers would have seen at that time, like Freaks or, you know, any of the B drive-in movies. This is one of the last considered drive-in hits, although there's still drive-ins, but I guess specifically films that were released to drive-ins, and this was kind of the end of that era, this and like Bonnie and Clyde, but this is one of the last ones to really hit, to really permeate the culture through those drive-ins, and this feels like one of those. It feels naturally like one of those, with the like I'm coming to get you, Barbara, and all of that, but then you slowly realize that this film is darker. One thing I think this really introduces to horror is nihilism. Certainly that was there before in literature and things of that nature, but the nihilistic nature that will always be in zombie films is absolutely something that came from Romero. Certainly he wouldn't do it as extremely as he did in this film and other films, but that whole idea of that we might all be wiped out by zombies and it's probably all going to just destroy all of us is something that he very much felt. There's kind of a darker nature in the 60s and 70s and 80s horror stuff that we could all just be potentially wiped out as humans. Something that, you know, when they kind of clean it up and make it a little nicer and maybe we'll save ourselves, doesn't really have the same scariness as Night of the Living Dead. I often find one of the reasons I like the crappier versions of this film is the blacks are so dark, like an empty darkness that I can never escape, that I always know is there underneath, like the idea of death, basically, that's always a part of it. Have you ever looked out at the ocean at night and wondered if you swam out, if you'd ever come back, if you're kind of sitting on the edge of nothingness? And I think Night of the Living Dead has that spirit within it, but with that kind of crappier, unrestored black and white, you feel that sense to it. You feel like maybe I'm in the wrong point in history, and maybe I have reached a very dark, scary place that's going to be the rest of my life, if I even live that long. And that's so unnerving, but it still feels kind of like a cheaper B movie, and certainly it was made that way. I don't think George Romero didn't know he was just going to change horror as much as he did. This was made right before kind of the independent boom of horror that would happen in the late 70s and so forth. And I think what really works about this film is it had social issues, which was very much in vogue at the time, between things like what would happen in cinema and even what would happen in 70s television with people like Norman Lear. The idea of talking about social issues through, you know, these kind of normal avenues of entertainment, which honestly wasn't really even that new. It was something like people did before, but it was like a bigger thing that people did a lot more. What Night of the Living Dead does in it is actually quite interesting. There's always a lot made of Dwayne Jones, who plays Ben, being the lead in this film because he is black. You know, Sidney Poitier had already won his Best Actor Oscar. In the Heat of the Night actually came out a year before this film, and it wasn't as like kind of revolutionary sometimes as portrayed. Although in a horror movie, it was quite different and was quite revolutionary. But what I think actually works about this lead is what's actually in the text of the movie. And that's one of the things I find most interesting about Night of the Living Dead, is as much as and I'll get back to the Dwayne Jones thing, don't worry. What I find so interesting about this film is when I often think of this, I always go, oh, Night of the Living Dead, 63. Definitely 63. And then every time I go, oh, 68. Like right when the Hollywood system was falling apart, right when you had the movie brats, right when you had all of this happening. You know, Bonnie and Clyde was a year before, like I said earlier. Easy Rider was happening. Things were fucking changing. And you don't think of Night of the Living Dead in that. It's kind of weird sometimes, our selectiveness in film history. Even though we have all these dates and we could just go, what came out in this year? And oftentimes we don't put it on there. That might be because Night of the Living Dead took a little while in cult circles and to build up and become what it was, particularly through late night viewings on television and in theaters. And it wasn't just, you know, just it kind of boomed and exploded and splattered all over the screen in a certain regard. It's interesting how it's not put in that vein of the people who were coming of age at that time, even though, you know, he would then come out again towards the end of the kind of New Brats thing with a major zombie film with Dawn of the Dead, and having, you know, not only one incredibly influential zombie film that changed the whole genre, but two, which shows how amazing of a director and a figure in horror that George Romero is and always will be. But the original script of Night of the Living Dead, and what I find interesting about this film is there's often so many themes about it that I don't necessarily connect to the late 60s, and I never really have. It's more because I'm stupid and I thought it was a different year, and I always think that, and the reasons for that aren't really explainable. It might be because I had a shitty VHS copy and, you know, the 8 was sort of rubbed off or something, or just because I'm stupid. But I think a lot of what the ideas within it, from like the very end of it and the ideas of like the conflicts within the house and things, I was looked at as more universal. I don't necessarily think the zombies talk about the silent majority or talk about like Vietnam or something like that. I think it just talks about human nature in general. Thus why like the themes of this have been able to apply to so many different things throughout the years, and not just the kind of very specific things, that and copyright law, but mostly because of the ideas of this. But I think with Dwayne Jones, what's interesting is he originally, that part was written for a white guy. And oftentimes you had people in a room together trying to survive something was not new, basically. There was always like that idea. It was in classic Hollywood like a ton. It wasn't like a new idea, but what George Romero does with it is actually very smart, and he takes on all these socio-political ideas that not necessarily they were going to do. There's not much difference in terms of just the idea of people trying to survive than this in like the Poseidon Adventure or something. In this, to have a black man as the lead, they really go into that. And notice also that when you watch this film, that he has done everything to board up the house, to basically do everything. And then when white guy dad just fucking shows up out of the basement and is just bossing everyone around and saying all these things, and even Barbara, in comparison to his life to hers, is almost laughable. He's like, I was at this diner and there was a gas truck and there were 10 of these guys and I could see there was nothing in their eyes and like everything was burning, and I was at this diner and I had to get the car to get to safety and all these people were crazy. And Barbara's like, so there was this one zombie and I think my brother might be dead. And he's like, oh my god, all right, I'm just gonna keep boarding up this house because clearly, what the fuck? Like, and she doesn't react to anything he says, which is like, holy shit. That is insane. Like, that is the most like colorful, amazing thing of like world building in the whole film. And she just like is just like still into the whole like, so I saw this one zombie, and you're like, hey, that's clearly not a normal thing, but like maybe like you know, listen to what he has to say, because holy fuck. But you're just like, no, I mean, you know, I'm sure it's her brother, so I shouldn't minimize that, but it's also like holy fuck, seriously? You're just gonna let Ben's thing go? Like, he does pretty much everything, and then just kind of swoop in and sort of take advantage of it and boss him around and so forth. And there's a lot to read into there. In fact, there's a ton to read into there. If he wasn't black, it wouldn't represent as much as it does, and that was actually very smart of Romero. It says a lot about American culture, frankly, and America in general, than it wouldn't really if he was just, you know, some like, you know, stupider white guy, which was originally the intent. And because Dwayne Jones, his audition was so good is why he got the role, and a lot of it was improv and so forth, and he did a lot more with the character, which I think really works for this film. He's probably the character everyone likes the most. You know, it's like him and Barbara and the parents and the daughter, and then everyone forgets about the young couple. I noticed they were like kind of so forgettable. I was like even watching this, and I've seen this movie several times, I was like, oh right, those guys. Like I just assumed it was like 5 people in this house, and there's 7. I mean, other than the truck exploding with gas, they're not like too important. They're not the best written. Dwayne Jones, who's an incredible actor, I think everyone does their roles very well, and Romero knows how to use them, but I think Dwayne Jones excels with the material. I wish he had a much better career. I loved him in Ganja and Hess as well. He is just out of this world good in Night of the Living Dead. He brings kind of the soul of the film. He's that one character like a Han Solo or something who you want to follow the film. His skepticism is kind of bringing you in. He's the audience surrogate, and with the audience doubting everything, and he's able to speak that through his performance. And I think Dwayne Jones is a great actor. Should have gotten more work at the time. It's kind of a shame. I'm not blaming anyone who worked on this film. I'm just saying in general, someone should have, because I really liked him in this. He's very much the most memorable part of this whole film. There's something to be said certainly about how the music works in this film, and there's a lot of stock music, but it works so well. It often makes this film feel creepier and scarier. Like, this does feel very much like a midnight movie, something you'd watch late night on TV. Romero really showed himself as an A-class director in this, particularly how he used the house. And I think one thing that all of the Dead films really do is they use a location incredibly well. And it's interesting, you know, when we talk about Dawn of the Dead and how they use the mall in that film, but in this, how they use the house is quite ingenious. First off, it feels a little unnerving and weird to be in someone else's house, and I think the film really gets that at the beginning. But also the idea that at first it's Ben and Barbara, and you're kind of establishing that, and you're establishing where you are, and as soon as you're getting a little sick of Ben and Barbara, or you feel like you might get sick of those two, everybody else shows up from the basement, and the dynamic of the film changes actually quite a few times. It's kind of interesting how many tonal shifts Night of the Living Dead has, from the beginning with Barbara and her brother, to, you know, she runs from the zombie, then she meets Ben, you have a whole section with them, and then you have everyone else. So things keep changing when people are introduced. It would be one thing if you show everybody at once, and you kind of do that rather quickly at the beginning, but this film really builds within that world. You don't fully understand how they're zombies, something to do with some satellite and Mercury or some crap, I don't know, who cares? It doesn't really matter. It's very much a MacGuffin in terms of like, hey, there's a reason, but who gives a shit, really? You're stuck in this house, and you're stuck in that feeling, and that's what Romero's really doing. I love how he uses a location so well. It really gets you in that location. If you look at a film like Stagecoach, which has everyone in a stagecoach, that film like has it all right there. And obviously, where are you gonna hide? Stagecoaches aren't that big. But in Night of the Living Dead, Romero understood, like, hey, we have this whole house, let's really use it. And supposedly that house was like going to be demolished so they could really like have fun with it, and certainly they did. But I like how he really uses that, and I like how they play around in the world, and how you're only hearing it from radios and television and so forth, the media at the time that you could hear it from. And that's probably what you would end up doing in a zombie apocalypse, and it kind of works a lot better than them just explaining it at the beginning. It feels a little more mysterious because you're not sure what's going to happen. You do feel like they're not fully in control of it, and maybe the conclusion of this film is not the conclusion of it. Now, obviously, we know it's not because there are like a lot of sequels and stuff, but watching this original film, you don't necessarily feel like that. You don't necessarily feel like they've kind of saved themselves or saved humanity. The whole idea of the cops like killing him, I think a lot of people say is very real, because it was the 1960s and Martin Luther King had just happened and so forth. When the film was finished, by the time that had happened, Romero kind of disregards the Samexcomex or Martin Luther King's assassination had much to do with this film. But I do think that that's kind of something that has not become less socially relevant with Night of the Living Dead over time. I think it has stayed socially relevant. The one thing about it is that it's not like the guy saw a black guy and shot him, though. I mean, if you watch the scene, he kind of just sees kind of like a shadowy figure and just shoots them, which is also disturbing because it doesn't look like they like checked. It was just like, oh, they're probably a zombie, I don't give a shit. And that's also kind of socially relevant in terms of police officers and so forth. I do find that interesting, and it is interesting the ideas that people can put on this film, and I think you can continue to do that because it is kind of universal in what it's doing. If Romero was trying to talk about a certain political ideology or something that was going on at the time in terms of protesting and civil unrest, he certainly did it quite well, but he did it so well that you can apply it to other things, not in kind of a blanket open to interpretation way, in a way that it speaks to all of us because it's so universal and amazing in that way. This film almost plays a little more broader than most horror films, but almost perfectly so. The whole idea that all of us will kind of tear ourselves apart, and that Ben has to witness that himself, and realizing how disappointing humanity can be, is kind of an interesting way to show a horror movie. Part of the horror is what's in the house, part of some of the horror is what's outside of the house, and I think that was something that was really real at the time. You know, both we have things to fear on the outside and the inside, and they will probably both tear us apart at some point. Night of the Living Dead is a classic because it is able to say things that will continue to permeate the culture, that will continue to make us think about these things, but they're also amazing and cool and frightening and scary and awesome and all of those things. I've never watched this film and been bored by it. I'm often surprised how it plays on so many different levels. Watching it this time and reading how it was very influenced by Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, the idea of the I Am Legend story, not the Will Smith movie, but like that story and like the Last Man on Earth, the Vincent Price film and so forth, and the idea of being alone in this zombie world, and how, you know, technology, or us not really understanding what technology will, you know, do to the earth and do to us, which is certain environmentally kind of something that speaks to us as well. It's interesting as I'm even discussing this and as I was reading into things about Night of the Living Dead, how many things I was like, oh my god, that's still relevant. That's still relevant. This means this, but it's still like worked then, it works now, it works as a silly B movie. It is kind of dumb and funky in some ways, but I still find it actually sort of terrifying. Maybe it's because people are watching the restored version. I like watching kind of crappier versions of things. It's how I grew up watching movies. It doesn't really bother me personally, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. I watched it my own way, but then I found a nicer restored version and rewatched a few scenes right after, just because I wanted to see how they look different, and it did look beautiful, and I still think it had all that meaning in it. I like, you know, even the naked zombie. Everybody remembers the naked zombie. The naked zombie's on the poster. I like how he did the whole thing with different kinds of zombies. And this film, you know, obviously doesn't say zombies in it. They say ghouls a lot, but I don't think ghouls sounds as cool. George Romero is one of the great horror directors, and certainly I don't think his entire filmography is flawless, but the films that he hit were not just hits, they were astronomical in what they did to our culture and to horror and what they said and what they continue to say. And Night of the Living Dead is an amazing film. I don't know which one's better, this or Dawn of the Dead. I think Dawn of the Dead might be a little more enjoyable and fun, partly because it's at a mall, and who doesn't like going to a mall? But Night of the Living Dead kind of shows how promising a director he could be. I mean, just filming in a cemetery, in a house in a cemetery. Seriously, what a better place to have a zombie film? Like, you have a house in a cemetery at night. Like, holy shit, like, was he good at doing this? It's like kind of remarkable. Not only did he set up the genre, he knew how perfectly to make that genre. Even today, the premise of this movie is like the perfect idea for the zombie film, and that's how he made it. That's why this film holds up so fucking well. Night of the Living Dead is the kind of crazy cult horror film that is more than that. I almost, you know, people say it was a cult film. It is a cult film. It's not. It's more. It's more than anyone could ever think a horror film could be, and it did that. It broke down the genre. Without this, we wouldn't have splatter films. We wouldn't have the gore we have. People were shocked by the gore. It was actually right after the ratings board came in, like a week after or something. Like, pretty much ratings changed right after, not because of this. It was going to happen anyway. But like, a lot of teens and younger people were able to see this film, which is probably why it kind of hit the culture as hard as it did. And knowing you could use horror to say some of these greater ideas that weren't just like like, you know, kind of philosophical, intellectual ideas, but it's cultural ideas and ideas that just hit you in certain ways. I mean, that ending is like a boom. Like, there's so many things about this that hit you and hit you fucking hard. This film does so many different things, and rewatching it this time, I was just shocked at like how well it plays like a B movie, but how well it excellently plays like a B movie. Sure, you can make fun of this and go, yeah, but it's sort of dumb. But yeah, B drive-in movies were sort of dumb, but none of them were able to say as much as George Romero was able to say with this film, and none of them were able to be as entertaining and as groundbreaking and as shocking and as grabbing as Night of the Living Dead was. Night of the Living Dead is a one-of-a-kind, big, major film and one of the most influential films of all time, and there's a reason for it. It is a beautiful, amazing movie, and there's no reason not to see it because it's like really easy to see. So if you haven't, like, seriously, just like type in the title on YouTube, and it's not illegal or something. This is one of the great all-time first films, and you could almost say he could never fully kind of follow it up, but he still actually managed to do that as well. Dawn of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead are two of the greatest horror films of all time, and probably two of the greatest films of all time. And what George Romero did with them is something that I don't think I could ever truly be able to fully intellectualize, because there's so much there to go into and read into, that you can go and hit certain things that will mean certain things to people even 100 years from now. And that's something that not a lot of directors will ever get a chance to do, whether they're important now or they're important in 20 years. George Romero's masterpieces will still be that, and will still be influencing people, because he found a way to tell something about human nature, the nihilism of it, and how we will all rip each other apart while also seeing some really cool zombies eat a lot of human flesh. I think is something that makes these films hard to escape and hard to forget, because they are the real greatness and uniqueness that they are, that no one will probably ever be able to achieve again, to the point that George Romero was with Night of the Living Dead. So if you have seen Night of the Living Dead and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. Thank you for watching the Halloween week of videos. If you watched all 5, thank you very much. If you just watched 1, that's cool too. It's always a great thrill to review 5 horror movies from 5 different decades, and I hope you enjoyed them. Have a happy Halloween, and thank you for watching.